Welcome, everyone, to the fourth episode of the PlainGains podcast. Today, we have a special guest, Coach Baxter, who's a physical therapist and online coach. Why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Okay, so my name is Kyle Baxter, originally from Vancouver, Canada. On paper, I am a physical therapist. In practice, I am more of an online coach slash educator for trainers, etc. I've basically held almost every job in the fitness industry, starting from like PT to gym manager to actually running logistics of a gym to high level athletics and then into the clinical ish realm because I just work online right now and consult, and then kind of blend the two of online coaching and physical therapy, and then do some education on the side with a company called Prescript out of the United States. So pretty much do everything.
That's awesome.
Yeah, so I actually wanted to, I guess, start talking about RDLs because I've seen your post and like you RDL insane amount of weight for reps. I think I was like, what, 5 plates maybe?
Yeah, I wish not quite. We're getting up to the four and change, but
Really? I swear I saw like 5 plates on something. But I think RDLs is a cool place to start because to me, at least as a coach, it always seems like the hardest exercise to cue or like the one that people seem to struggle with the most, at least in my experience. So maybe, I don't know if you could kind of go over some cueing stuff or the biggest mistake people can make during some RDLs.
yeah. So the classic RDL or hinge cue that we'll see is the stick on the back, which for most people who struggle with RDLs, we are falling too far forward. So we have a lot of weight on our toes, our rib cage is pushed forward, and we have a hard time kind of like shifting our weight back, which is what a hinge is. And we have a hard time getting some like mid-foot pressure, which is needed for a hinge movement. So for RDLs, the first thing I'll do is whenever I need someone to bring their center of mass or body back in space, I would always bring their arms forward in front of their body. So if we think about like a questionable exercise for strength or hypertrophy, but quite a good exercise for cueing an RDL would be like a cable RDL, where the cable is in front of you at the bottom, and then our arms are out, and that's going to force us that it's pulling you forward. So you have two options, either fall forward or shift our weight back. And that like weight shift back is what everyone seems to struggle with. So number one would be get our hands out in front of our body. Number two would be get our feet closer in towards the midline. And then the biggest struggle with people that I usually find with RDLs is we have troubles actually opening up our hips, right? So we'll look at it sometimes through the lens of like we struggle with hip extension, but we don't really struggle with hip extension because we're already in hip extension. We actually struggle with hip flexion. So using like a foam roller or a yoga block between someone's knees with a little bit of an adductor squeeze, we think about like reciprocal inhibition. I squeeze the foam roller, posterior muscles relax. I can get into deeper levels of hip flexion. So if I wanted to take someone who is extremely bad at hinging, I'd probably start them on the ground first with some sort of bridge, and then we get to like cable RDL with a block squeeze, and then we get into dumbbell RDL with block squeeze, maybe a heels elevated just to shift them back a little bit more, and then eventually to the floor. And then we just, as long as it looks good, we just progress to the next kind of progression of load or taking away a constraint. So
Yeah, that's an awesome recommendation there. I see the same problem with a lot of my clients is that they have the tendency to just bend straight down, kind of like they're going to pick something up. So one of the tools that I like to use, kind of like you mentioned with your cable RDL, is a belt squat RDL or like something in a pitch shark, because the way the pendulum moves kind of like this, like you said with the cable, it kind of pulls you forward, but obviously the angle is not going to be as steep as a cable would be. So it's a little bit closer to pulling off the ground as opposed to the cable. So I think that's a additional useful tool.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting how you brought up the heel elevated. I've always seen people do a front foot elevated. Apparently, it puts them more in like, or it just helps them like hinge a little better. I don't know if you heard of that before. Or is there like a right way to do that?
Yeah. So with when you say like front foot elevated, you mean like the forefoot. The if you had like a
Yeah,
ramp, heels elevated would be a ramp normal way, and then forefoot
Hmm.
elevated would be ramp opposite way.
yeah,
I
facing
don't
you.
think either. I don't think either of those are incorrect. It just depends on what we need to get from the person in front of us or ourselves. So if we think about if the linchpin to the RDL is you shifting your center of mass back and you can get like some pretty good foot pressure already, I would probably use the heels elevated because we can already get foot pressure and then shift our center mass back. If the linchpin to our RDL is we can shift our center mass back, but we have like that supinated foot, we can't push into the midfoot very much. I would probably give the reverse wedge to give you a little bit more of something to push into. If we think about the wedge is just a extension of the environment being the ground, right? So if I can't bring my foot down to the ground, I bring the ground up to my foot. Now I can get a little bit better pressure, understanding that it will likely limit the range of motion with the forefoot elevated, but we'll get a better range of motion. And then once we get that, we can go to either rear foot elevated or back to the ground. So I don't think either of them are incorrect. They just both facilitate a different constraint that's going to help someone hinge.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I know it's pretty popular on social media to demonize the front foot elevate or the forefoot elevated RDL because your hamstrings do not cross the ankle joint. So it's not adding any stretch, despite people feeling an interesting sensation when they do that. But it is important to remember that it does have utility for certain individuals, like you mentioned, people that may have a supinated foot or they can't really press great into a flat ground. So it's a great point.
Yeah.
Yeah, actually, I really like how you brought that up or explained that. And I like to kind of jump into a from going to a regular RDL to more of a B stance. And if you think that there is like a time and place for it, is it a good hypertrophy movement, or is it a good way to, or is it good coordination movement? Maybe we can elaborate a little bit on the benefits of doing a B lateral or B stance.
Yeah. So with the B stance, with anything where we're truly single leg, that's when we're going to be able to, one, actually adopt some sort of gait cycle mechanic where we are shifting our hips in the frontal plane. So if we were to look at the deepest level of hip flexion in a B stance RDL or any split squat, we would have a hip outside of a knee, which is what we should have to fully internally rotate and stretch the glutes, which is what we get every time we take a step. We should shift over so that we have that frontal plane shift and our center mass is over our base support. So having a B stance RDL technically puts more stretch on the glutes. Obviously, it's underloaded, and that stretch is not quite in the plane of the resistance, right? The glutes work basically in the sagittal plane if we identify with the planes of motion, which that's another conversation. But the glutes basically work through extension. They externally rotate at the very end. So when we're looking at a B stance RDL, basically if someone has problems with foot pressure on one foot and not the other, I might give them a B stance RDL. to mitigate load and put more local stress on tissue, right? So if I RDL 4 plates, it's quite a large global stress in relation to the local stress that I could get if I just did a dumbbell B stance RDL, right? So if my goal is a little bit more, depending on how it fits in the program, it might be used as like a local hypertrophy movement. It might be used if we have like, say we're like a strength, I don't want to use the word athlete, but strength person who wants strength, and we do barbell movements and we shift in a squat. That might be a good way to get us into the hip that we're shifting out of. And then it would mitigate load, so it would have less global fatigue and more, hopefully more local fatigue. So you can be used a little bit more of like a hypertrophy movement when like a barbell isn't as much. A bilateral RDL just suggests more load. So that's why I would use like a B stance RDL.
Yeah, that's great. I use B stance or unilateral movements for a similar reason, especially with the RDL, how much erectors and for me, also upper back stimulus that I get from it. It is volume that I can't neglect in my total fatigue for my upper back and erectors. So if I'm in a phase where I'm deprioritizing my back muscles, adding in a unilateral movement for the hamstrings is definitely one way that I can prevent some extra fatigue on my back. So good point there.
Yeah, agreed. And it's important that you keep bringing up foot pressure because that's pretty much the thing I wanted to also bring up. That a lot of people's ankle mobility, and I think you mentioned this before, that they kind of rely on like how they apply pressure on the foot. Is that did I interpret that correctly?
Yeah. So when we talk about ankle mobility, it's really it's a real thing. Don't get me wrong. But I don't think that tight calves are the culprit, like we are sometimes told. So in order to get the foot to dorsiflex, we need three things. Number one, we need the shin to travel forward, right, from some sort of negative or neutral shin angle into a positive shin angle where I'm closing down that anterior side of the joint. I need the shin to rotate inwards towards the midline, so internally rotate the shin as it travels forward. And then I also need the foot to pronate so that the talus can get out of the way, because the talocrural joint doesn't run in a straight line, it runs at like an angle, right? So if you think about that angle is coming higher on the lateral side and lower on the medial side, we'll internally rotate that shin, pronate the foot, and then the shin can continue to pass by the talus and into dorsiflexion. So most people have a problem doing one, two, or three of those things. So if my center of mass is very far forward, good example, someone has bad ankle mobility in a squat, you give them a goblet squat, they immediately have better ankle mobility. Did you do anything to their calves? No. You shifted their center of mass back in space by giving them the anterior load, right? So my shin can't travel forward if it's already forward. So some people are already at their end range of dorsiflexion, or the place that that shin would hit the talus, and we don't have time for the shin to internally rotate and the talus to get out of the way. So we get that dorsiflexion limited. A lot of people have that on like the right side. We'll get that like pinching in the front of the ankle. Number two would be like we can't actually rotate the shin in, which comes from I can't get pressure on the medial calcaneus and first met head as I'm going into deeper ankle flexion. And the third one is like my foot can't pronate, which is kind of a similar thing. I think one cue that really hinders people is like the gripping the ground cue. Gripping the ground, the tripod foot is a good cue because it suggests foot pressure everywhere. But if we're gripping the ground, we are basically contracting all of our plantar fascia and the muscles that are going to pull our foot into a supinated position. And our shin cannot travel forward into dorsiflexion if we remain in that supinated position. right? So a lot of people with bad ankle mobility are giving it to themselves because they're not letting their foot supinate or pronate, because pronation, also very misunderstood, has like got a very bad rap of like, hey, I have flat feet. It's like a flat foot is a foot that, as long as it has all pressure on it, it's a foot that's pushing into the ground. A foot that can produce force. If you look at any professional athlete, most of them have flat feet because they're really good at producing force. They don't have time to do supinate to pronate. They just need to push in right away. Especially like basketball is the big one that you'll see. So ankle mobility, dorsiflexion, it's really just the position of the bones is going to dictate what the joint does. And if we give the right input from the environment, aka foot pressure, and center of mass relative to base support, the muscles will adapt the orientation that we need to get into that position, aka the calf will be eccentric enough to allow your shin to travel forward.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And I think I could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure I've seen some research where people have tried to improve ankle dorsiflexion, and in people that do not have the problems that you mentioned before, where they're self-limiting their ankle dorsiflexion, like a lot of stretch protocols don't actually increase the degree of dorsiflexion that they do or that they are able to achieve by a significant amount. And I think a lot of people get confused when they're looking at their squat and they're like, oh, my ankles are my limiting factor. When in reality, their femurs are just like ridiculously long and their center of mass is all whacked up. So then they are in max ankle dorsiflexion, but they're not getting a deep squat because of their other anthropometrics. So I think that's a really good point and segues into why you may want to use heel elevation into particular squatting motions.
Yeah, and a big thing with ankle mobility that I see people always kind of like go to is like the classic, what is it, resistant band around the ankle, and then the kind of like push against the resistant band, or the resistant band pushing you back. And I think I broke my fibula. I fractured it, and then like that was always like the one thing I went to. At least in my experience, it didn't always help tremendously. It wasn't until I actually started doing more of the movements that you were talking about, or doing exercises that incorporated those movements to a good degree. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on like the resistant band on the ankle. If that can
Yeah,
help, or is
so
that over
the
exaggerated maybe?
no, yeah, so the banded distraction, the anterior ankle distraction. So like you put your foot up on the bench and then you have the band tied to the bottom of the rack and then you're jamming into dorsiflexion. And the theory is like you're pulling the talus down in order to create more space anteriorly in the joint, which if you get the band in the right place, it could do something. It could help you pronate a little bit. In my physical therapy school wasn't super like hands-on based, but there's like manual therapy techniques where you literally do like a tibio-talar distraction and like pull the ankle out and push the talus down, which is basically what the band is mimicking. But for a lot of people, we need to put the band in a specific place, and even if we do, if we don't have the right foot pressures or the right rotation of our shin, it's probably not going to do that much. So it's something that could work in theory, but I wouldn't go to it right away because there would be faster things that could make the change that I want. But the theory is there, and like it's not silly if you get the band in the right place, but it's like a little bit more of a meticulous exercise and it's quite passive, so you'll have to do something active after anyways. But I wouldn't say it's super dumb, but I wouldn't say it would be like my go-to for me to program it for something.
Right, and I don't know if you've seen stuff like this, but I know where I've seen some people talk about, you have your calf soleus, but then like below that there's a muscle that also goes all the way down. I believe it reaches like near the bottom of the plantar section of your foot. And so to really, if you want to like increase ankle mobility, you have to kind of like lift your toes up. and then bring the knee forward, and then that can stretch something under the foot or the muscle under there. I don't know if you heard anything about that. I can't remember the muscle off the top of my head, but
Yeah, so um like your sorry, it's cutting out a
I'm
little
sorry.
bit. So like your
Oh yeah.
peroneals will go down on one side, and then your tib post will come down on the other side, and then like your toe flexors will be the muscles that like come down across the medial side and underneath. So again, if you subscribe to the model of my ankle mobility or my foot mobility is limited because muscles are tight and I need to make muscles less tight, then that checks out um, in terms of something you might want to do. It's like, okay, this muscle crosses the ankle joint. It also crosses all of the joints of the foot and the toes. I need to extend the toes and also dorsiflex the ankle simultaneously in order to get a stretch on this muscle. That anatomically checks out. I think my model of how the body works doesn't follow the this muscle is tight, so we need to stretch it model. It's more of like this muscle feels this way and is in this orientation because of the either A, position of the joints or slash bones, or B, the interactions with the environment and the body thinks that it should be in this place, right? Of how we do everyday tasks, in which everything that we do in life, including sitting at these chairs that we're sitting on, is a task, right? Gravity is always pulling us down. So if someone is hunched over like crazy or has bad ankle mobility as they stand, it's just an issue with how they manage gravity for the most part. And then if we can reteach them a different way to manage gravity, dissociate some joints a little bit, we don't really have to do any stretching. So I think, yes, in terms of like that justification follows true if your model is the stretch and strengthen model, which they literally teach you that in physical therapy school. Like every single class, they just said, strengthen what's weak, stretch what's tight, which is very, very basic. But the model that I use doesn't really follow that very much.
Yeah, and just because something is tight, does that automatically mean that it's weak, or is that a pretty big misconception in the field?
With tightness, right? Like a muscle doesn't really get tight, right? Tightness is a feel. So you basically, I could divide it up into like 3 different times you might feel tightness, right? So your muscle is stuck in an eccentric orientation and it's eccentric all the time. Therefore, it feels tight. It is stuck in a concentric orientation. So example would be like an anterior pelvic tilt. Your hamstrings would be eccentric all the time. They would feel tight. Or if we have like a very depressed sternum, right? A very depressed anterior rib cage, my shoulder blades come over top, and now I have like upper traps and rhomboids that feel tight all the time, but they're really just lengthened 24/7. The second one would be I have muscles that are in a concentric orientation, or short, if you will. And when I try to move them into an eccentric orientation, they don't like that, and I feel tightness, right? Chest, lats would be 2 of them, right? But in my mind, the muscle is just reacting to the position of the skeleton. So if I get my sternum up, now my pec, for those of you just not watching this but listening, I just took a breath in and my sternum came up. Now my pec, my origin and my insertion are farther apart. So my muscle is automatically eccentric. So I think if something is tight, it doesn't mean it's weak. For something to feel tight, usually that muscle has the potential to contract better than a muscle that doesn't feel tight, because most tightness is when something is very, very eccentric. So it's like your hamstring feels tight because it's lengthened, which means I can shorten it pretty easy, right? Issues arise with muscles that are concentric all the time, because if something's concentric, I can't contract it because it's already contracted, right? This gigantic light that's shining in my face, I can't turn it on, but it's already on. So for example, like chest, lats, and glutes are the main ones where like people are like, I can't feel it. It's like, it's already on. That's why your delts are doing everything, because your chest is already on. It can't contract it. We need to make it eccentric before we can make it concentric.
Yeah, those are really good points, and it brings me to the point of why a lot of times you see or I guess hear the sensation of tightness in individuals who live more of a sedentary lifestyle, or maybe they work a 9 to 5 office job where their back is completely eccentric or stretched out the whole time, and their chest is concentric because they're crouched over their computer typing away for hours. And then you put them on a resistance training program where they're doing pushing motions, they're doing pulling motions in multiple different planes of motion, and they're like, wow, my pain or tightness is completely gone. So a lot of times it just comes from actually moving through your entire joint range of motion, or what you're able to do in order to alleviate that tightness. So those are good points.
Yeah, I liked how we kind of brought that up here because it's something that a lot of people kind of misconfuse all the time. And before we could move up to talking about the knee, I actually wanted to finish talking about the foot with your thoughts on like I've always heard that Converse are like the worst shoe because of like the shallow toe box when you work out, or if you need flat feet or you need like a flat shoe to work out. Do you have any comments on that maybe?
Yeah. So a shoe is an extension of the environment. It's not an extension of the foot. So if we think about like an Adidas lifting shoe, it has a heel, but it doesn't have a super big arch, and it's very, very stiff. Very similar to if I was to just give someone like a heel wedge. If we think about a Nike lifting shoe, it is the same as the Adidas, except for it has a gigantic arch in it. So it's actually going to limit your ability to produce force, possibly, but it's going to give you a trade-off because it's going to keep you externally rotated so you can get more depth. Right? So if we think about like range of motion, if we move away from the midline, we can get more space. But in order to produce force, we need to move towards the midline. So that shoe might, because we can't pronate, it keeps us supinated all the time. That's why you see a lot of people that wear Nikes, their knees shoot in like crazy because they can't actually pronate their foot because the shoe is stopping. And then when we talk about like coming into the toe box conversation, yes, it's possible that a narrow toe box on like a Converse that is rubber in the toe box might affect your ability to have full foot pressure. But if we can lift with full foot pressure out of the shoe, for the most part, you can lift with full foot pressure in the shoe. I don't think that you'll hear the argument, and you guys can point fingers at exactly who on the internet yells this argument into Instagram 24/7 of shoes with a narrow toe box will crush your toes together. I don't think that's really the culprit. And they'll cite studies from like 1905 that look at sedentary people that wear like shoes you would wear with a suit and say, look at this person who walks on the ground all day with no shoes on versus the person who sits at a desk all day with shoes on their cramped feet. That might be a thing a little bit, but for most of us, It's the way that we actually put pressures into our foot and manage our center of mass all the time that is going to affect where the pressure goes through our foot, which is ultimately going to affect how well the foot can move and how well the foot cannot move. And if the foot cannot move, we're going to get these funny shapes in order to manage gravity. And then that's when we see someone with Nikes on and they take off their shoe and they have a funny foot. And then people on the internet say, nah, it's the shoe. You need to get barefoot shoes. But barefoot shoes are still, there's a caveat with those because yes, a human was not meant to live with a shoe that squishes their foot. That is 100% correct. The other side of that argument, a human was also not meant to walk on hard concrete, wood, tile, all the things that we walk on all the time. Right? So you put someone with a messed up foot that's 300 pounds in vivos, and they're going to have a ton of problems because they can't absorb any of the force and they're just smashing their foot into the ground when their old Nikes or Asics or whatever they're wearing before actually gave them a little bit of cushion and allowed them to absorb some force. So I don't think shoes squish your toes, to recap, unless you're like wearing office shoes 24/7 and just sitting around, or like wearing steel toe boots maybe, but steel toe boots actually are quite wide in the toe box. It's more of like how you manage your center of mass and how you produce force through the foot that's going to affect your foot shape. For lifting, the shoe is an extension of the environment, not of the foot. So you probably want to have a shoe that is hard and allows you to produce force as we lift. If we need the shoe to get into certain positions, understand that it's usually a trade-off of force production for range of motion, but 99.9% of people will benefit more from the range of motion change than they will the detriment of force production.
Yeah, I
Make
just
sense?
want to echo those points. Those are great. Personally, I use a flat, or I guess it would be a deadlift slipper for my hinging type motions, and that's solely just because it allows me to get closer to the ground, so my range of motion can be greater. Whereas on a squatting pattern, I use squat shoes because the range of motion versus the force trade-off, like you mentioned, more range of motion is going to be better for me. And I think that's one of the reasons why you see a lot of powerlifters squat with flat shoes, and that's just because they can produce more force than they can when they're squatting with heeled shoes, especially those who don't have problems getting to powerlifting depth. I do want to ask, do you think that toe spreaders are overrated or underrated or useless? What do you think about the toe spreaders?
This is actually something I revisited lately. Um, I think toe spreaders in a passive sense are a waste of time. So like, I wear my toe spreaders to bed to spread my toes apart. Probably not the play. People do that. So, but toe spreaders in a active sense of I'm doing some split squats or prep work and my foot's really messed up and I can't get foot pressure, spreading the toes apart could help the transverse arch move a little bit better to get some nice toe pressure and foot pressure. So I can't give you a definitive answer, but I'd say like they're not dumb, but a lot of people don't understand what they're actually using them for. And I would have to play around with them more on an actual human who has messed up feet to give
Hmm.
you a better answer. But passively, they're dumb. Actively, probably have some utility, but there's also things that could help change the shape of the foot.
Yeah, I
If that
definitely
makes sense.
see. Yeah, definitely. I definitely see what you're saying with like using the toe spreaders to apply more even toe pressure or whatever. I just see a lot of the times people are marketing these toe pressures to like correct bunions and all of these sorts of things. And honestly, I don't think that that's going to make a significant difference, especially when you're using it in a passive sense, like wearing it to bed. I would suggest the passive sense for toe spreaders is when you painted your toenails and you need them not to touch so they don't get messed up. So, good
Yeah,
points.
That's a good
and I
utility.
hope for the
I
people.
I retract my previous statement.
Yeah.
And I hope for the people watching this or listening, that could kind of help clear some things up because I have a lot of people come to me at the gym like, near my house, and they're like, "Oh, you should like switch out of Converse and stuff." Those are like the only shoes I wear to work out recently, but I don't think it makes that big of a difference, like you said. And on top of that, like I still feel good applying pressure on certain things. Besides, because I live in Miami, most of our time is spent on flip flops, so I don't think that really does much. But I like to go up to talking about knee pain and going into like a deep uh, a knee flex position or like in a deep squat. Most people always seem very restricted to go down there. Um, and maybe if you could kind of elaborate on how we can or how some people could consider certain things when we're going into deep flexion of the knee.
Yes. So the first thing to understand is if you were to look at a textbook, it would tell you that the knee is a hinge joint, which is not incorrect, but it's also not really the full picture. Because if we picture a door hinge in our brain, that's not really how any of the joints work. So if you were to Google a picture of the knee joint, we would have a bone and another bone. I'm putting my two fists up together, and there's a space in between, and that's the joint space. And the bones are just floating in fluid. That fluid is our joint. So no bone actually touches the other bone. Even when things are bone on bone, I still don't think that the bones are actually touching. There's pressure on the subchondral bone, but bone on bone is not a thing. So if we look at we can't have a hinge without a fulcrum. And if we know the bones don't touch, now we know that the knee cannot be a hinge because it cannot have a fulcrum. So understanding that, if we look at the femoral condyles and we look at the medial side and the lateral side being different lengths, and we look at the fact that the tibia has to rotate in order to extend the knee, and the tibia has to, rotate externally to extend the knee, the screw home mechanism, if you want to Google it. It also needs to internally rotate to flex the knee. So we come straight back to our conversation we had before about ankle dorsiflexion of we have two bones, femur, tibia. Tibia needs to internally rotate relative to the femur in order to get deep knee flexion. How do you get the tibia to internally rotate? By cueing the inside of the foot. So if we can find medial heel pressure, we can find midfoot pressure, we can control our center of mass. Your dorsiflexion fixes are also your deep knee flexion fixes. A good test I like to use for knee flexion is, especially when a powerlifter comes to me and they're like, hey, I have knee pain. I just like took it light on squats and only did 200 kilos. And then I'll put them against a door frame. And I'll put like their body along the door frame. So like their ASIS, their hip, and their femur are all pressing into the frame. And then I'll tell them to bring their heel up to their butt. So in order to bring the heel up to the butt, the knee has to flex and the tibia has to internally rotate. And that shows me that if we can get something in open chain, we might be able to get it in closed chain. So what happens with 99.9% of people, because I know that it's going to happen before I ask them, is they'll have a massive hamstring cramp. So imagine you can't even bend your knee against just gravity, but then you're going to put 200 kilos on your back plus your body weight and try to bend that same knee. And then people wonder why they have knee issues, right? So in order to load the range of motion, I need to have the range of motion. So for the knee, very straightforward. Look at pelvic position. Do we have a massive anterior tilt? If we do, we're likely going to limit hip motion. And then do we have foot pressure so that we can move the foot to move the shin? That is part of the knee. I don't really cue knees very much. I cue like proximal and then distal. And the knees are just like a byproduct. Like if you can cue foot pressure and keep someone's center of mass back, like you never have to worry or talk about knees ever. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
Yeah.
those are great points.
No, and it's great. I like how like all the things come together when we talk about ankle, and then like how the ankle can also affect the knee. Where it's like some people think it's like just because you have an ankle problem, it's solely on the ankle, or some people think that because you have a knee problem, it's solely just around the knee. But in reality, it just could be the things around the knee. Um, I know when we get into deep squatting, sometimes people tend to feel like really, really tight hips, like what feels like really uncomfortable. Um, do you know what those things could be or how maybe to go at it? Maybe if they try, and then they may not even have, tight hips. They just go down there and it just feels like it feels like a really compact, I guess, feeling in the groin. Do you know what, I don't know if you ever had to deal with that or do you know what I may be talking about?
Yeah, so there's really, when we look at hip things, there's three main issues that we usually deal with. And then there's three solutions that are really like the same solution. So the first one will be like the anterior hip, like pinching, if you will, of we are running out of space in the anterior hip, likely because we are approximating both anterior sides of the joint simultaneously, right? So as the pelvis moves down, the femur is getting closer to the pelvis. But if I'm anteriorly tilting or anteriorly tilted, the pelvis is also getting closer to the femur, and we run out of space before we should. And when I say we should, that's like kind of about 120 degrees of hip flexion-ish, depending on how abducted we are. So that would be number one, like anterior hip pain. It's really just like a center of mass issue and pelvic issue. If we look at pain in kind of like the adductor groin region, that could be one of two things in my experience. So number one, your adductors have to stabilize your pelvis and pull your pelvis into an internally rotated position, your pelvis into an internally rotated position, not your hip. So if we can't stabilize the pelvis very well, if we're squatting a very heavy load and like our other stabilizers aren't very good, adductor has to do a lot of work to stabilize from the bottom up. So we might have adductors work too hard. That could manifest as like some discomfort in the groin region. We could also have an inability to internally rotate the pelvis, in which the adductor is trying extremely hard to internally rotate the pelvis. Usually we get like it almost feels like you pull your hamstring in a squat, but that's really like either your adductor magnus doing too much work to extend your hip because you're anteriorly tilted, or your adductor is trying to like pull you into internal rotation. And then the last one in the whole would be once we get to that 120 degrees, we need to re-externally rotate. Right? If we externally rotate, our adductors need to be eccentric to an extent. If we can't re-externally rotate, once we drop all the way down into the hole, we might feel a little bit of that tightness. If we can get all the way past like the internal rotation part of the squat into like the very, very deep hole of ass to grass, if you were to have like an Olympic lifter catch a clean, you can see like the knees come back and we like go into more external rotation. That could be like, hey, if I get pain there or discomfort there, it's probably like I can't re-externally rotate my hips. And then the last one would almost be like the outside hip pain. Usually when we have like a client who carries more mass, usually more adipose tissue, we have like pain on the outside of the hip. If it's really bad, I deal with like people who have pain on the outside of the hip when they sleep. It's basically we have excess pressure on the outside of the hip because we're so externally rotated. And then if we're externally rotated and also anteriorly tilted, which likely come together to try to find some internal rotation, muscles like the glutes and IT band or glutes and TFL will pick up leverage to like pull on the IT band. And then that will just create more pressure on the outside of the hip. And then as we go into a loaded squat in that position, we have more and more pressure on the outside of the hip. And then that pressure manifests as a feeling laterally on the hip that doesn't feel very nice. So those are all the
Yeah,
hip things that I can think of.
that makes sense. I do have one question because I get this question a lot. It's particularly in individuals who do unilateral leg press for like a glute bias type thing where they're internally rotated or their foot is close to the midline of their pressing. And when they get into deep hip flexion in that position, they get a lot of hip pain. So could you kind of explain what that hip pain is, why it's occurring, and how they can fix it?
Yes. So for the most part, a lot of those people are likely just too adducted. So if we think about like drawing a line straight up from our hips, and then we put our feet there, that would be like aligned or whatever. So we take one foot off and we bring that foot closer to the midline. But what we don't think about is if the pelvis on the seat is rotated towards the stance leg, I'm getting excess internal rotation from proximally and distally. So I put my foot in and I'm rotating towards the stance leg. And if we only have to get into deep hip flexion, we need eventually some external rotation. So basically by trying to bias glutes so hard, we're just taking away the space that we have to move. It's very similar to like if someone was to try to do like a press like this, like reaching across their body. If I bring the humerus past the AC joint,
Hmm.
we might get a pinching at the front of the shoulder. It's the exact same thing in the hip. If I'm bringing the femur past like the pubic symphysis-ish, maybe a little bit closer to the actual joint, we'll get some jamming in the hip because we can't actually get external rotation
Yeah,
at the
no,
very end of hip flexion.
that's good. Yeah, I think honestly that's going to help a lot of individuals because people are like, oh, I really like unilateral leg press, but it always hurts my hip. So they just need to put their foot out a little bit further away from the midline and they'll be all right. So that's pretty good.
Yeah, and I always hear people saying that they have to kind of like fix their I guess their hip or their knee position into like an externally rotated position the entire time during a squat. Whether it's like because they're afraid of going too much into knee valgus or knee varus. Um, and I know sometimes naturally, even for people who have like relatively healthy lower portions of the body, like powerlifters and stuff, you see them lift very heavy, their knees kind of just naturally cave in. I don't know if that's like a natural mechanism for the body to kind of just like push the weight up, and your CNS is just trying to just get the job done. Um, I wouldn't consider that good or bad. I don't know if you could kind of like shine some light on that.
Yeah, so in order to produce force, we need to move towards the midline. So in order to move towards the midline, we need to move first away from the midline, right? So if someone has no space, new person to the gym, you get them to squat, their feet are shoulder width facing forward. What will happen as they go down into the squat? Their feet will turn outwards to like 45 degrees, maybe more, right? That's just them trying to find space so that they can push into the ground on the concentric to move back towards the midline to come up towards and push into the ground to come up on the concentric. Same thing that happens in bench press. What happens when someone has a heavy bench press? their elbows will flare out into abduction. Abduction is moving away from the midline to create more space to move towards the midline. So if we think about looking at a powerlift squat or someone doing a 1RM and their knees come in towards the midline, that is usually just a strategy to produce force because the load is really heavy and they have to move towards the midline to produce force. The faster you go, the more force you need to produce. So you'll see like a sprinter, an Olympic lifter, right? Those are people who do things very fast. Their knees fling in towards the midline to basically pre-stretch the glutes to like then fling them back out at the very top of the movement. I don't think that this knees coming in towards the midline should be called knee valgus, because knee valgus in my mind is a different thing. And I will explain. So if we see a powerlifter who has full foot pressure and their knees shoot in towards the midline, that is foot going towards the midline, pronating, shin going towards the midline, femur going towards the midline. That's an entire distal limb internally rotating to produce force. On the contrary, so that would not be valgus. On the contrary, if I have someone who's can't get full foot pressure, their knee shoots in, so their femur turns in, but their shin turns out, and they have pressure on the outside of their foot, now I have that knee joint that is twisting one bone one way and one bone the other way. That is what valgus is. So if we see knees shooting in, we have to look at, okay, is this person, are they shooting in all the time, or are they shooting in on the latter half of the set or the heavy reps? And then when the knees shoot in, is everything going in as a unit, or is one thing going in and something else is coming out? That means we're getting a twisting through the knee, which means we're likely to lack range of motion at the foot or hip. That's what I need to address. So there's definitely a difference between, that's like probably number one most confused thing in terms of like physical therapy and knees, is like what is actual valgus and what is actually you just producing force. Right? If you did a squat, if anyone does a squat as fast as they can, like drop down, do a squat, and then come back up, fast as eccentric, fast as concentric, you will see your knees shoot in towards the midline. Because you need to produce force.
Yeah, those are great points. Honestly, I think that sheds light on one of the biggest misconceptions and definitely clears up common definitions. People always say, oh, knee valgus is so bad. And like, yeah, maybe it actually is, but what's actually happening? Are you actually going into valgus? Probably not. You're probably just moving. So yeah, that's a pretty good point.
Yeah, love that, honestly. And for any PTs watching, I hope that you guys could see more of a applicable point of view rather than just point of textbooks. Um, Now, I know we're running out of time, and I just do have two other points for us to kind of like hit, so we could get into talking about origins and insertions, moving them simultaneously. But before that, I kind of just wanted to go a little bit over. A lot of people experience pain when they reach overhead and do like any type of like tricep extension on the elbow. Would you consider that very common? And if so, do you maybe have an idea why they can experience more elbow pain when like lifting any kind of overhead tricep extension and doing it in more of a anatomical position?
Yes. So in order to flex the shoulder, right, we need that rotation at the humerus in order to bring the shoulder into higher degrees of shoulder flexion. Similar to us needing more hip rotation to go into deeper degrees of knee flexion. We can draw similarities between literally what we just talked about and the question that you just asked of the knee and the upper limb, the elbow. They act extremely similar, right? As I flex the arm, I need to pronate. As I extend, I need to supinate, which would be external rotation, right? So I'm lacking rotation through the forearm, or likely rotation through the shoulder of I can't even get my arm overhead so that I have a good orientation at this elbow joint, but then I'm going to load through it. Then I'm going to probably use a handle that limits my rotation to my forearm. So now both joints or both bones aren't rotating very well. And then the tricep pushes on one part of the joint. We have a joint that has a lot of pressure on the posterior side, not a lot of pressure on the anterior side. Then we get that elbow or tricep pain. So really, people are doing overhead tricep movements when they don't have the ability to flex their shoulder. Right, so doing things in mid range, which would be like from 0 to 60 degrees of shoulder flexion, are the easiest because they need the least amount of actual movement. Right, if I was to move into true extension, so from 0 to like negative 30 degrees of shoulder flexion, or like 60 to 90 to up to 180, that's when we actually need the rib cage to move, the scap to move, and the glenohumeral joint to move simultaneously. Right? In 0 to 60, I don't need rib cage or scap to move very much at all. I just have glenohumeral joint movement. So that's kind of like the range of motion that we'll have. If we think about, we have all the range of motion when we are born, and then as gravity crushes us, we do some dumb things in the gym, and we slowly lose all the range of motion. But the lower range of shoulder flexion, where the glenohumeral joint is acting independently, that's the joint motion that we lose last. So that's likely where people actually have range of motion, but then they just go out of their active range, can't rotate through their forearm or humerus, and then they put force through their elbow. And it's very similar to if someone doesn't have hip rotation or shin rotation, goes down into deep knee flexion, they're going to feel knee pain. Same thing with the elbow.
Yeah, that makes sense, and it's honestly one of the reasons why I think, at least for a majority of people using or doing overhead tricep movements using cables where you can adjust where exactly your shoulder is comfortable to move in that plane and it doesn't end up hurting your elbow is a lot more useful than doing overhead with like a barbell or dumbbells or something like that, where gravity moves only in one direction. You can't adjust it at all to find what position is most comfortable for you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm honestly glad we got to kind of like mention that a little bit because it's something that I see a lot of people uh always ask me or saying like, hey, why do we always get elbow pain or why can't I do this movement efficiently? So I think it's cool for them to understand why that can be occurring and maybe create the correlation of that and the knee joint to kind of them start or for them to kind of start thinking on their own and maybe making better training decisions when they go to the gym. Um, I guess to finish off, we could go over the now you sent me a video on doing the Bayesian curl, which for those of you who don't know, the Bayesian curl was a movement, I guess, discovered by Menno Henselman. He's a exercise scientist. You could post great content, and the point of the movement, to my understanding, he has a whole article on it, is basically training the biceps what it seems to be in like their full try to train the triceps in their full contractile range by leaning back in a high cable stack to create like the angle in the cable and to create the 90-degree angle at the cable to train the biceps in more of a lengthened position and then to lean a little forward to train the biceps in more of a shortened position or mid-range position. So I guess if you'd like to elaborate why you may think, or any thoughts on the exercise in general at first.
Yeah, so anytime we're moving, I have three things that come to mind. One of them is the exercise that you just described. But anytime that we're moving origin and insertion simultaneously, we are shortening a muscle, but not under tension, or lengthening a muscle, but not under tension, or not lengthening or shortening a muscle at all. So regardless of what movement it is, we always want to, I understand the Bayesian curl argument. My thoughts are I would always want to stabilize one side of the joint and move the other side, even if it's a biarticular joint. And I think more could, if the argument is I need to put a lot of tension in the lengthened position, and then as I move, I continue to have tension in the shortened position. I would argue that giving two exercises in which bias the shortened and lengthened position and also keep the origin of the muscle stable as we move the insertion would yield more actual tension through the muscle instead of halfway through the movement having something that needs extreme amount of coordination. We can't standardize reps as much, and we're moving the origin towards the insertion as the insertion moves through the origin, which means we're actually putting less tension on the muscle because we're not actually moving the load towards the origin. We're just moving the origin closer to the insertion. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I definitely understand what you're saying. I do think the argument more so, at least the way that I use the Bayesian curl in programming, is your shoulder is staying in a fixed position the whole time. So the movement that's changing the angle in the cable is coming from the hip joint. And so technically you are technically moving the origin in space because you're moving your whole body in space. But with respect to moving the origin in your actual body, it's not moving much at all. But I think the utility for the Bayesian curl in particular comes from transitioning from a client that has only ever done mid-range or shortened position bicep movements, maybe like a machine preacher curl or a dumbbell curl or whatever it may be. They aren't really used to having extremely high levels of tension when the arm is completely extended. So having the ability to like really feel the bicep contract under high levels of tension because the cable angle changes helps them transition into ability to feel a good contraction when they're doing like a wrist height cable curl with the back of your arm supported by like a bench or something like that. So I think it's more of a tool for utility and just feeling mind muscle connection rather than like maximizing hypertrophy or training a particular joint range of motion like you may use a shortened position movement for.
That makes
Um,
sense. I feel like I just
sure.
haven't done enough Bayesian curls to give a good
Yeah, it's also just nice
opinion.
variation. It feels pretty good, honestly, if you are able to do the coordination. In terms of stability, it's not great. So I would definitely prefer to have like an elbow supported wrist height cable curl, but in most gyms it's like really impossible to set that up. So having the ability to use that for variation is nice in my opinion.
Yeah, and as for the Bayesian curve, I mean, sometimes like obviously for those of you who have seen that video, I just mean like do this for like the best exercise triceps. That's just how, or for the biceps, the algorithm just likes quick eye catchers or like noise catchers, I guess. But in when I talk to like when I actually think about the exercise, you increase coordination demand, which is something that I'm not a huge fan of. I'd rather like just like I like to stay stable or still. Obviously, when I do the exercise, it feels good, but when I see a lot of people doing Bayesian curls, they pretty much just stay still, and it just looks like an incline cable curl. So it's like I don't know if like what's the difference, or maybe they just kind of bring just the elbow like a little higher, like I guess to flex the shoulder. But I mean, I still would call it an incline cable curl. As for the Bayesian curl and trying to kind of like lean forward, you may even start biasing more of the short position then bias a little more in the lengthened position, which is what we want, would be the ideal goal, especially with like the recent research and lengthened position stuff. So um, those are like my actual thoughts on it. I'm not saying it's a bad exercise. I think it could have a place, or if you like it, I don't think you'll die doing it. But I did see to put it more into like a different application. I know you and Dr. Jordan Shallow were doing a demonstration on the T-bar row, chest supported T-bar row, saying that if you arch your back too much, you could be moving the origin away from the insertion. Can you maybe elaborate on that a little bit? Because I see a lot of people start to do that full range of motion stuff because of, people like Dr. Mike who always, I don't know if you heard of Dr. Mike, but when he contracts in the T-bar row, he really like just arches the back. I don't know if it's because of how his structure is built or if he just wants to bias the erectors maybe. Maybe if you can elaborate more on why we want to keep I guess, the spine neutral and move the scapula towards the spine since we can't move the spine towards the scapula.
Yeah, I think the argument for the Bayesian curl makes more sense to me than the argument for the full ROM upper back row. So if we understand which muscles we're trying to train, if we move the insertion and origin simultaneously, especially with the upper back, we're not only changing the vector of force in which we're pulling, we're not getting using the rib cage as a fulcrum to protract around. And then we're also moving the origin and insertion simultaneously, which means we're not really even shortening or lengthening the muscle at that point. And in the lengthened air quotes range, which is still lengthened. You're actually just kind of like making it a little bit more of if I'm like bending over quite a bit, you're making it a little bit more of an actual like lat movement because we can't actually initiate with the upper back if I'm in crazy amounts of elevation, but my hand is also in like 120 degrees of shoulder flexion. And then the massive extension in the concentric, I think it's just a misunderstanding of how the erectors work. So with the pull there, we're really just using our lats to extend our spine because our erectors don't really work concentrically. They work reflexively to stabilize the spine. So it's something that we can't actually contract very well, we actually can't contract them at all consciously. So yeah, with the full range curl or full range row, sorry, we're moving origin and insertion, so that's like a no for me. And then if we're moving too far into extension, like the retraction ends at a certain point, and just moving the whole body back in space more is not getting any more out of the movement, in my opinion, except for like a questionable shortened lat contraction from your lats and QL extending your spine.
Yeah, so I think those are all valid points, and definitely, I don't think you're getting a lot of extra shortening out of like arching your lower back or whatever, finishing the row high. But I'm not sure if this is exactly the reason why Dr. Mike does this, but in a T-bar row, because the motion is like a pendulum, by coming more off of the pad, you're simultaneously reducing the amount of load that's occurring at the shortened position, or like the amount of force that you have to produce to hold the weight there. Like you can kind of like if you like came all the way off the pad, for example, and stood up, you would just be having less load under gravity because of the way the pendulum is. And so maybe the reason why they are doing this is so that they can emphasize more lengthened position work by simultaneously reducing the amount of force they have to produce when their muscle is fully shortened. And now, obviously, I don't know if this is a great argument, but it's just a potential strong man for a reason why you may do this. I don't know what you think about that.
Yeah, I mean, like, if that's the argument, it makes sense. But my counter argument would be the T-bar row already does that for you. Right? Like,
Yeah, no,
already
that's a
drops
good
off.
argument.
Like, especially most T-bars that they make them with a smaller lever arm to try to take up less space in the gym.
Mm-hmm.
Like the Atlantis one is nice because it's like super, super long. So it doesn't actually
Mm-hmm.
drop off that hard. And it actually, you could stay like in a nice position. But most of like the very, very short arm T-bars will have
Mm-hmm.
like excessive amounts of tension and then literally no tension in the
Yeah.
shortened position. So I
Mm-hmm.
don't think that like the T-bar needs that because it already does that for you. Like that's literally what the machine is made for, biasing
Yeah.
the length and position.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Obviously, it may depend on the T-bar. I know that the one that I have at my gym, the Body Masters one, is effectively like this angle, and so pulling from like
Yeah.
here to here, there's not a big drop off, which kind of sucks, but it's whatever. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great, and I think I like talking about that so people can get an understanding, and instead of just like unconsciously or unknowingly doing these full range of motion stuff without having an idea what they're trying to target and considering the different ranges of motion, because there's the joint range of motion, there's the muscle range of motion, there's the exercises range of motion. So just things to take into consideration.
All right. I think that's a pretty good place to wrap that up. So, for everyone watching, thank you guys for watching. Please go ahead and hit the subscribe, like button, and notification bell. And if you are listening on Spotify, please give us a 5-star rating, as that helps us out and helps our channel grow. If you would like to see more content with Baxter, please let us know in the comments below. And we hope that you enjoyed this episode. Thank you all for watching again.